World History of Christianity, Chapter 12, Part 3. We are right in the middle of page 482. In a climate in which direct religious experiences and even revelations were more readily accepted by the Church, there was at the same time an increasing stress on doctrine and authority. The need to place uncompromising doctrine at the center of the Catholic faith seemed especially urgent, not only because of the traumatic experience of the French Revolution, but also because of the more recent threats to faith of creeds like liberalism, socialism, and nationalism, as well as resurgent Protestantism. Catholics who were worried by liberal tendencies within the Church or by the division of the faith into national variants, which could seem like so many potential heresies, urged Catholics throughout the world to seek direct guidance from the Vatican and to support the authority of the Pope against that of individual national bishops. This tendency to look to Rome for increased authority, known as ultramontanism, gradually won over many Catholic adherents and became the dominant Catholic outlook of the age, although it also had influential critics within the Catholic world, particularly in the liberal Catholic movements of the Netherlands, Austria, Germany, and, to a lesser extent, Switzerland and England. When the Vatican declared that an ecumenical or general council of all Catholic bishops would be held in Rome in 1869, and the issue was raised as to whether the doctrine of papal infallibility should be defined, Ultramontanes, led by the French Catholic Louis Violot, in his newspaper L'Univers, and liberal Catholics, who found spokesmen in the German historian Ignaz von Dollinger and the English historian Lord Acton, became increasingly divided from one another. A propaganda war, which was of as much interest to liberal Protestants as to Catholics, raised the temperature of the debate over papal authority and ensured that reactions to the outcome of the council would be heated. In the end, the First Vatican Council of 1869 through 70 decided, against the wishes of the liberal minority, to declare papal infallibility to be a tenet of the Catholic faith. Although the definition of papal infallibility, which was eventually agreed, circumscribed the Pope's powers, sharply distinguishing infallibility from inerrancy, and limiting ex cathedra statements to those concerned with faith and morals, it was nevertheless felt as a blow by liberal Catholics, who wished for all authority to be retained by the Council of Bishops, or who believed any definition of papal infallibility to be inopportune, since it would play into the hands of anti-Catholic polemicists, especially in non-Catholic circles, where papal infallibility in faith and morals was popularly understood to mean papal inerrancy in everything. The decrees of the First Vatican Council were seen to represent an aggressive aggrandizement of papal power. They therefore helped to galvanize support for Bismarck's Kulturkampf, a repressive campaign against indigenous Catholics in Germany, and to revive anti-Catholic feeling within the British Isles. A small number of Swiss, Dutch, and German Catholics felt strongly enough about the outcome of the council to break away from the Catholic Church and join together in a body known as the Old Catholics. Most Catholics, however, either approved of the definition, which won further sympathy after the loss of the Pope's temporal power in 1870, and particularly because of the anti-clericalism of the recently unified Italian nation, or else resigned themselves to acceptance. Yet the presentation of the First Vatican Council as the symbolic triumph of a reactionary party over liberal opinion within the Catholic Church, which prompted outraged pamphlets by many non-Catholics, including the British Prime Minister William Gladstone, who published The Vatican Decrees in Their Bearing on Civil Allegiance, a Political Expostulation, in 1874, was to affect perceptions of Catholicism by outsiders for at least the next 100 years. It was the urgent desire to establish what were thought to be fundamental aspects of Catholicism in correct theological form, which led the Catholic Church to pronounce on the question of the Immaculate Conception of the Virgin Mary in 1854, and to define the doctrine of papal infallibility in 1870. For the same reasons, it attempted to steer the spontaneous piety surrounding Marian apparitions into Orthodox channels, eventually approving some pilgrimage sites like Lourdes, while rejecting others such as Marpingen. In what was seen by many to be a revival of Counter-Reformation intolerance, the Church, fueled by the energetic proselytizing of the Ultramontanes, sought both to stimulate greater religious commitment and to stamp out practices which it believed to be unorthodox or pagan superstitions. Through the increased zeal of priests, missionaries, and lay societies, and through the insistence of both popes and bishops that Catholics be educated in religious schools, married within the denomination, and discouraged from mixing with those outside the community, the experience of being a Catholic in the 19th century became increasingly distinct from that of being another sort of Christian. In addition to the formal requirements of Catholics to hear weekly Mass and to take the sacrament at least once a year, new or newly revived lay societies called confraternities or sodalities urged their members to aspire to sanctity, imitating the holy poverty of St. Francis of Assisi, or preparing themselves for a happy death. Revivalist missions held by Jesuits, Redemptorists, Passionists, and others encouraged more frequent confessions and communions than had been standard in the 18th century, and recommended lay people to take part in exclusively Catholic devotions, like the public recitation of the Rosary, meditations on the Sacred Heart of Jesus, or the thrice daily recitation of the Marian prayer, the Angelus. Although missionary Catholicism resembled contemporary evangelical Protestantism in its intensity and emotionalism, it also became more distinctively Catholic through its increased insistence upon doctrinal rigor and denominationally specific devotional practices. As Christians throughout Europe returned to what they believed to be the fundamentals of Christianity as transmitted by their own distinctive denominational traditions, they inevitably became less tolerant of the equally exclusive claims of others. Increasingly, religious identity came to be mingled not only with political affiliation, but also with idealized forms of ethnic and national self-definitions. In Britain, periodic no-popery riots, particularly acute after the alarms caused by the Oxford movement of the 1830s, and formal reestablishment of the English Catholic ecclesiastical hierarchy, the so-called papal aggression, in 1850, expressed the popular sense that Protestantism was an integral part of national identity, a notion which continued to complicate the problems of the predominantly Catholic island of Ireland. In the Kingdom of the Netherlands, the overwhelmingly Catholic territory of the South broke away in 1830 to form the independent nation of Belgium, which was to feel the stresses of political and ethnic divisions once religious solidarity began to fade in the 20th century. In Germany, Bismarck's aim to unite the new nation under the banner of Protestantism in the Kulturkampf made as strong an initial appeal to agnostic liberals as it did to zealous Protestants, but was abandoned when Catholic support was needed to combat what was coming to be seen as a greater threat, that of socialism. Over the course of the 19th century, Schleiermacher's contempt for what he had scorned as early as 1799 as the poorly stitched together fragments of metaphysics and morals that are called rational Christianity came to be shared by Protestants and Catholics of all nationalities. Emotive, romanticized apprehensions of religious identity which replaced enlightened Christianity tended of their nature to be more distinctive and exclusive. The 18th century ideal of mutual tolerance, along with the willingness of many Christians to join across denominational and national boundaries in order to seek a universal natural and rational religion, appeared to be disintegrating politically and socially, as well as theologically and devotionally. Liberalism. However much some devout Christians, conservatives, and political reactionaries may have wished to return to a golden pre-revolutionary age, it is never really possible to turn the clock back. One way of viewing the progress of institutional churches and theological developments over the course of the 19th century would be to say that the immediate reaction to the French Revolution went too far, thus provoking a recurrence of the very dangers it sought to avoid. Attempts to protect the church with the arm of the state may have been successful in reversing the effects of revolution in the short term, but inevitably led to the alienation of substantial numbers of ordinary people from both pillars of the old order. Among those most likely to nurture political grievances were religious minorities or dissenters from the establishment, who resented having to support a church to which they did not belong, and remaining sympathizers with the radical aims of the revolution, who were unlikely to be impressed by a church dominated by what they saw as unfair privilege. Those who disapproved of the governments who ruled them were equally likely to resent national churches as symbols of the hated state. As conservative politics began to be associated with the faith of those who worshipped in state-protected churches, and liberalism or radicalism with those who were excluded or chose to exclude themselves from establishment, religion as a whole became more politicized. Much of what happened to the Christian churches over the course of the 19th century was akin to what happened to the conservative or ultra-conservative governments with which they had come to be so closely associated. Just as the specter of revolution haunted monarchical governments throughout the period, leading them to alternate between reaction and pragmatic concessions to liberal but not Republican or socialist demands, so the national churches feared widespread atheism and the wholesale rejection of Christian morality and practice as the religious counterpart to revolution and the natural accompaniment of political radicalism. When liberal or radical theological opinions were expressed by clergymen or laymen within established churches, the choice presented to church authorities seemed equally stark: to reject unorthodox opinion altogether, thus preserving ecclesiastical authority at the expense of church membership, or else to concede the necessary minimum to conserve as much doctrine as could be reconciled with current intellectual fashion. The gradual polarization of opinion between the twin extremes of radicalism on the one hand and ultra-conservatism on the other, particularly after the European revolutions of 1848 through 51, was to make liberalism a pragmatic compromise for increasing numbers of ordinary Christians. It was to influence their understanding of the faith as well as of contemporary politics. Loosely known as liberals because of their insistence on freedom from governmental constraints, self-conscious progressives demanded religious toleration, constitutional government, elective assemblies, trial by jury, laissez-faire economic policies, and the abolition of press censorship. Their unofficial manifesto was John Stuart Mill's On Liberty of 1859, which declared that the sole end where mankind is warranted in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. Apart from being recognizable through their opinions on a cluster of political and social issues, and by appearing to place their faith in an indefinable good called progress, liberals are not easily defined as a group, at times represented by political parties calling themselves liberal, and at others simply existing as a voice of protest in journals, newspapers, and books. They continued to present intellectual and sometimes overtly political challenges to those whose dream was to maintain the post-revolutionary status quo. Although political liberalism was associated in Catholic countries with anti-clerical opinion, the philosophy of liberalism was, in theory at least, neither religious nor anti-religious, since it claimed only the right to freedom of expression for all, or most, shades of opinion, without seeking to define which opinions were best. In countries like England or the Netherlands, where there existed a wide variety of Christian denominations to choose from, many religious minorities, although instinctively conservative theologically, pressed for religious toleration as government policy in order to advance their own interests. In Britain, for example, it was pressure from religious dissenters anxious to transmit what they saw as correct theological beliefs to future generations, which eventually forced the government to recognize nonconformist forms of marriage, to introduce civil registration of births and deaths, and to permit only non-sectarian religious teaching in state schools. The liberal slogan of a free church in a free state, which advocated a separation of powers on the American constitutional model, became a rallying cry not only for religious but also for irreligious thinkers, being championed by men as different in their aims and beliefs as Cavour and Montalembert, particularly in countries where church and state were so closely tied that the national church appeared to represent little more than privilege. Anti-state sentiment could easily turn to anti-Christian polemic, and political frustration go hand in hand with atheism. Radical opinion seemed most likely to flourish where there was at least denominational choice, as in France, Prussia, Italy, Spain, and Portugal, where those who became alienated from established churches could find alternative ethical codes and teleologies in socialism, communism, or scientific materialism, creeds which were to gain substantial numbers of converts over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries. Intended primarily as a safeguard of religious liberty and as a protection from the interference of state-supported churches, liberal religious policies, nevertheless, had the effect of leaving room for the freedom to be irreligious as well as merely nonconformist. As Owen Chadwick has put it, from the moment that European opinion decided for toleration, it decided for an eventual free market in opinion. The very doctrine of pluralism held dangers for the unity of Christian faith, since the existence of alternative systems of thought tacitly challenged the notion that the truth was the same for all people and helped to erode both legal and social pressures to conform to any single variety of Christian practice. To conservative thinkers, liberalism could therefore appear as a sort of cancer within the Christian body politic, which might, without warning, spread, undoing all the good work of the post-revolutionary settlement and ending in widespread atheism, social leveling, and the collapse of the established order. It was to this perspective that Pope Pius IX appealed when in 1864 his Syllabus of Errors condemned as a false proposition the notion that the Supreme Pontiff ought to reconcile or adjust himself to progress, liberalism, and modern civilization, and declared the teachings of socialism and communism to be injurious to faith. It is a measure of the change which occurred in the dominant European climate of opinion between about 1830 and 1860. However, that Pope Pius IX's pronouncement, which would have seemed nothing more than a commonplace conservative response in the immediate aftermath of the French Revolution, made him a laughingstock in the liberal heyday of the 1860s. A cartoon which appeared in the English magazine Punch in 1864, depicting the papal bull as a deranged steer charging headlong into a brick wall, seemed to many to sum up the future of ultra-conservative opinion, whether in politics or in religion. The central tenet of liberalism, that all opinions should be allowed to be freely voiced, had theological as well as political and economic implications. Liberals characteristically claimed for themselves the fearless and impartial examination of received wisdoms as part of a broadly progressive movement which held it as an axiom that open debate was the most effective means of arriving at the truth. Enlightenment debates over aspects of the Christian tradition which had seemed embarrassingly irrational to the 18th century philosophers, especially scriptural and contemporary miracles, were soon reopened under the confident banner of 19th century liberalism. Theologians at the University of Tübingen, led by F.C. Bauer, and deeply influenced by the historical philosophy of G.W.F. Hegel, began, as early as the 1830s and 1840s, to argue that several of the books of the New Testament were written too long after the events which they described to be of any historical value. According to this new school of biblical criticism, which came to be known as neology, the significance of the Christian story was increasingly seen as one of poetic myth or moral excellence rather than of literal truth. Like so many other progressive intellectual movements which shocked orthodox sensibilities, the primary aim of the Tübingen school was to establish Christianity on a more secure footing. The movement meant, rather, to prove the existence of the historical person of Jesus than to undermine the credibility of the Christian faith. But when David Friedrich Strauss, one of a number of Hegelians to emerge from the Tübingen school, published his Leben Jesu, the life of Jesus critically examined, in 1835-36. The work appeared deeply damaging to Christianity. By attempting to detach the stories of miracles which had grown up around the historical person of Jesus, Strauss intended to prove beyond the shadow of a doubt that the carpenter's son had really lived and preached, and that he had been a moral and rational person, so that his gospel might be approached with confidence. But by discrediting the supernatural and miraculous element in Scripture, Strauss's Jesus was presented as merely a man, not the Son of God or Christ. Such a fundamental critique of the central message of Christianity was hardly likely to be received with acclaim, and Strauss was immediately dismissed from his academic post as professor of theology at Tübingen. Although he never taught again, Strauss's work brought to the surface what was to become an intellectual problem for many in the second half of the 19th century, namely the apparent difficulties in reconciling scriptural revelation with what were coming to be thought of as the scientifically impeccable methods of historical investigation and textual criticism. A more immediate difficulty for many believers from about the middle of the 19th century came in the form of moral revulsion from aspects of Christian teaching, like the small number of the elect and the existence of a material hell, which seemed to many to be unworthy of a compassionate God. Such criticisms voiced what was perhaps an inevitable reaction to the severity of much preaching during the evangelical and missionary revivals which followed the French Revolution. Through sermons which could be terrifying in their evocations of hellfire and threats of eternal damnation. Children who had suffered acute terror of the day of judgment, or who, like John Addington Symonds, were convinced that the devil lived near the doormat in a dark corner by the passage of my father's bedroom, were perhaps among the most vulnerable to losing their faith altogether when they outgrew their childish fears, although others adapted their understanding of Christianity as they grew up. Christians who were prey to intellectual or moral doubts about Christianity were not likely to be reassured by the widespread publication in the 1860s of the notion that the New Testament might not offer a dependable account of the Incarnation. In England, long sheltered from continental neology, a sensation was caused by the publication by a group of university dons and Anglican clergymen of a series of short articles known collectively as Essays and Reviews, 1860, which presented French and German criticism of sacred texts to a largely devout public. One of the most disturbing chapters was written by Benjamin Jowett, a celebrated figure in English society and Regius Professor of Greek at the University of Oxford, at that time primarily an institution for the training of Anglican clergymen, whose, on the interpretation of Scripture, suggested that the textual methods which were routinely applied to classical texts should also be used in interpreting the Bible. The imperative which Jowett delivered to theology students and laymen alike, and which he italicized for the greatest possible emphasis, was, interpret the Scripture like any other book. The publication by established churchmen and theologians of a work which appeared to discredit the literal truth of much of the New Testament launched decades of controversy over how the Bible ought to be approached and what the essence of its message was. The Church of England, which had already lost many of its more dogmatically minded churchmen in the Oxford movement and had alienated a good deal of evangelical opinion through its increased Catholicity, gradually absorbed the central message of biblical criticism over the course of the 19th and 20th centuries, though not without difficulty or heated controversy. It was in France that the most devastatingly reductionist of all approaches to Scripture was penned by a respected theologian, Joseph Ernest Renan's Vie de Jesus, The Life of Jesus, 1863, attacked each of the New Testament miracles in turn, ignored the ethical content of the gospel message, and left a portrait of Jesus as an amiable but otherwise undistinguished preacher from Galilee, who was presented as entirely and exclusively human. Biblical criticism combined with widespread unease about the validity of a good deal of traditional Christian preaching confronted believers who wished to reconcile their faith with the new learning with two unpalatable choices: to cling to their creeds and doctrines despite liberal claims that these were unreliable, or else to accept the new scientific theories and adjust the nature of their faith accordingly. The problem which provoked crises of faith among many educated Christians was to continue to disturb Christians of varying degrees of religious commitment throughout the 20th century. Science and religion. When people in the first half of the 19th century spoke of a conflict between science and religion, the sciences which they had in mind were primarily the historical sciences. Attacks on the authority of Scripture, which had been launched by continental textual critics and Hegelian philosophers of the Tübingen school, appeared at first to be easily rebutted by evidence drawn from the natural sciences. Liberal theologians who returned to the most skeptical 18th century critiques of revealed religion to restate the terms of their faith were opposed by equally confident defenders of orthodoxy who revived Enlightenment arguments for God's reality from the evidence of the natural world. Neither side simply reproduced the old arguments verbatim, however, but reappropriated them, subtly altering their tone and emphasis. In England, which had escaped revolution and where enlightened defenses of Christianity were therefore least disturbed, one of the most popular works of religious orthodoxy throughout the 19th century was William Paley's Natural Theology, or Evidences of the Existence and Attributes of the Deity Collected from the Appearances of Nature, which was first published in 1802. Paley's thesis, essentially nothing more than a restatement of the old argument from design, was that of the intricate wonder of creation, demonstrated the existence of a creator who was both intelligent and benign. Were there no example in the world of contrivance except that of the eye, he wrote, it would be alone sufficient to support the conclusion which we draw from it, as to the necessity of an intelligent creator. Paley's argument, although presented in the language of scientific observation and structured by an overwhelming number of detailed examples of the marvels to be found in nature, did not offer a formal philosophical proof of God's existence, but rather a hymn of praise to the Creator. That the eyes of mammals were formed in the darkness of the womb, that milk was produced by mothers at exactly the time that it was required, that the number of lactating teats in different animals corresponded to the number of offspring they would produce, all seemed to offer overwhelming evidence that every aspect of creation was perfectly attuned to needs which only an all-powerful Creator could have anticipated. It was because Paley's statement of the case was redolent of piety as well as appearing to be systematic that it exercised such a spell over the English-speaking world. At one English university, natural theology remained required reading for all undergraduates well into the 19th century, and at another until the First World War. Natural theology was influential not only in the biological sciences, but also among geologists who argued that the study of the earth could support the factual accuracy of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, whose authorship was traditionally ascribed to Moses. Such arguments were particularly influential in England, where the evangelical revival had heightened the importance of Bible reading for all sections of society, and the need to establish the objective truth of the Scriptures seemed correspondingly acute. A bequest left to the Royal Society of London by the Earl of Bridgewater for £8,000 to be spent on the publication of a work which would demonstrate the power, wisdom, and goodness of God as manifested in the creation, led to a series of lectures by Anglican natural scientists, afterwards published as the Bridgewater Treatises. Influential lectures by the geologist William Buckland argued that natural evidence supported Old Testament accounts of the creation and of Noah's flood. Some sleight of hand was needed to prove the consistency of Scripture with the evidence of fossil remains and the relics of dinosaurs. A number of scholars posited an enormous gap between the initial act of creation and the first day as given in Genesis, while others suggested that each day referred to a geological age rather than to a mere 24 hours. Yet Buckland felt able to conclude cautiously in his inaugural lecture as Reader in Geology at the University of Oxford, published a year later as Vindicae Geologicae, or The Connection of Geology with Religion Explained, 1820, that it may be safely affirmed that no geological theory has yet been proposed which is not less reconcilable to ascertained facts and conflicting phenomena than to the Mosaic history. With hindsight, what seems most important about the Bridgewater treatises is not so much the detail of their theses, but rather that they unwittingly helped to shift the grounds for faith from the evidence of revelation to that of scientific theory. For all their pious intent, attempts to support Christianity by means of the natural sciences set the stage for religion to be put on the defensive, since the corollary of allowing theology to be based upon up-to-date theory was to make rational arguments for faith vulnerable to changing scientific fashions. The celebrated confrontation between science and religion of the middle and late 19th century has long been associated with the publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection in 1859, which effectively demolished the common sense appeal of natural theology by offering a rival, religiously agnostic model to account for the variety of species to be found in nature. Darwin's arguments, which were deeply damaging to the beliefs of biblical literalists as well as natural theologians, created serious intellectual difficulties for a number of Protestant groups, particularly those in the English-speaking world who relied on Paley's works or who stressed biblical inerrancy. Darwinian notions of evolutionary development were much more easily reconciled with faith, both in 1859 and afterwards, in a number of other Christian traditions. The notion, particularly well developed in the Catholic Church, that Christian doctrine had not been delivered all at once, but gradually became manifest over time, a view which Newman had found so compelling that writing his essay on the development of Christian doctrine in 1845 helped to convince him to become a Catholic, allowed Darwin's ideas to be accommodated much more easily by some scientists, like the Catholic St. George Mivart or the Unitarian William Carpenter, who, although they found fault with Darwin's precise mechanisms for natural selection, did not see any difficulty to faith in accepting the notion of the evolution of species. Liberal Protestants, increasingly inclined to defend the spirit rather than the letter of biblical texts, were similarly cushioned from the blow. It was Darwin's The Descent of Man, 1871, which explicitly included mankind in the evolutionary scheme and could be seen as raising doubts about the reality of the soul and the origins of human conscience, which troubled most Christians and took longest to be absorbed. It was partly because doubts about traditional Christian faith and ethics had been raised by The Descent of Man that spiritualism, and later its more academically respectable cousin, physical research, both of which aimed to prove the existence of the soul empirically, became so widespread throughout Europe in the 1860s and 1870s, being treated as a serious object of intellectual inquiry by, among others, Arthur Conan Doyle, the creator of Sherlock Holmes, and Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-discoverer of Darwin's evolutionary theories. In retrospect, Darwin's most famous work seems less significant for its thesis than for the symbolic importance which was attributed to it in what gradually came to be seen as an antithesis between something loosely called religion and something equally loosely termed science. Despite the continued popularity of Whiggish accounts of the history of science, which see modern developments as a series of inspired discoveries by intellectual heroes like Galileo, Giordano Bruno, Isaac Newton, Charles Darwin, Albert Einstein, and others, a number of recent historians have pointed to the absurdity of maintaining that revolutions in scientific thinking could ever emerge out of an intellectual vacuum or come to be widely accepted in an intractably hostile environment. The criticism certainly appears to be borne out in the case of Darwin, whose theories, although they effectively undermined one particularly fashionable reconciliation of natural with revealed evidences for God, did not come out of nowhere, nor was their supposed incompatibility with faith broadcast without ulterior motives. The components which made up Darwin's argument for the evolution of species were not, as he admitted with characteristic candor, original. Theories of evolution of different kinds had been put forward by, among others, his own grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, and Robert Chambers, even natural theologians like William Buckland, Adam Sedgwick, and William Whewell had advanced the notion of progressive creation to account for the apparent extinction and renewal of some species. The work of Charles Lyell, a personal friend as well as a scientific colleague, had established the scale of geological time required for Darwin's modification of species, and a theoretical economist, Thomas Malthus, supplied the mechanism by which favorable variations might be preserved and unfavorable ones lost. But although Darwin admitted his intellectual debts and acknowledged frankly that many and grave objections could be advanced against his theory of descent with modification through natural selection, his recombination of familiar elements led to a theory which was at once as evocative as Paley's, while at the same time being more economical, since it could account for apparently useless variations and solve the moral problem of suffering in the world without having recourse to divine agency. Darwin, who had once intended to become a clergyman and was an admirer of Paley's rhetorical methods, as well as his meticulous observational powers, used both to good effect in The Origin of Species, which offered a literary as well as scientific tour de force. Although he sometimes liked to think that he worked on true Baconian principles, following the evidence wherever it might lead, he readily acknowledged that the moment of theoretical inspiration came from reading Thomas Malthus's An Essay on the Principle of Population as it affects the future improvement of society, 1798, some 20 years before the publication of his thesis. It was while reading Malthus, which was also the trigger for Alfred Russel Wallace, that the thought struck him that the extraordinary variety in nature need not have come about through the ingenuity of an infinitely imaginative God. Rather, the same phenomena could be explained in purely natural terms by positing the idea that the world was characterized by a Malthusian struggle for existence in which only those specimens which were best adapted to changing environments would live to replicate themselves, and so, by gradual modifications, evolve into separate species. For all its intrinsic merits, it seems unlikely that Darwin's Origin of Species, which was, after all, a hypothesis about the past, rather than a law which could ever be demonstrated experimentally, would have created the sensation which it eventually did, had it not been seized upon by anti-clerical polemicists and presented to an audience already made uneasy by the results of biblical criticism. When Darwin's theory was first presented to scientists at London's Linnean Society in a joint paper with Alfred Russel Wallace, who, although ready to publish first, was generous enough to share the credit with Darwin, it seemed of so little consequence that the Society concluded its annual report with the sad reflection that 1858 had not been a year marked by any of those striking discoveries which at once revolutionized, so to speak, the department of science on which they bear. It was not until the same theories were presented in The Origin of Species, which was published in book form in 1859, that Darwin's rhetorically powerful argument was made easily accessible to non-scientists. More important for its sales was the furor surrounding the publication of Essays and Reviews a few months later, which brought out the implications of Darwin's work for natural theologians, whose arguments for purposeful design appeared to be undermined by its central thesis, and for biblical literalists whose acceptance that all species had been created in the first week described in Genesis was flatly contradicted. Had Darwin's work not become embroiled in disputes between those who wished to promote or denounce theological liberalism, it might never have come to be known outside of a narrow circle of natural scientists. This ends part 3.